So my name is Victor Brilon. I'm Director of Product Management at Mobileiron. We're going to talk about the AppConfig community. This is basically a how-to session. We're going to go through some of the details. I'm going to give you guys a little bit of a background on the AppConfig community. I'm not going to go too deep into sort of the business work that went into it and the kind of the philosophical underpinnings of it. If you're interested in that part of it, please come find me afterwards. I did a separate session on that. We can talk about it. The focus here is going to be on deploying the pieces that the AppConfig community makes available, how it works end to end, and how it works with Mobileiron's platforms. I'll be using our cloud platform as an example. So, oh, they get. All right, there we go. Okay, so let's start with a really quick overview of what the AppConfig community is about. So the community was announced in February of this year at Mobile World Congress. It consists of 4 founding members, which is us, Mobileiron, IBM with their Mass 360 product, Jamf, and VMware with AirWatch. The philosophy behind the AppConfig community was we as the leaders in the EMM space looked at what it's taking enterprises to deploy apps and why application adoption in the enterprise has not grown at the same rate as in the consumer space. And there's a couple of answers there. One is there's lots of proprietary standards. You know, when everybody started working on this EMM space, everybody tried to do it a different way. So Mobileiron has their way of doing stuff, IBM has their way, VMware has their way. And as a developer, it's very difficult and painful to build and test to all these standards. As an enterprise, it's hard to test and deploy all these different permutations of technologies. So the goal is that the largest vendor in the space want to get together and create a standardized way of delivering application configuration, security, and best practices for enterprise applications. So, as I said, we want to focus on building a common approach for app configuration security. Rather than creating a brand new standard, we want to build on top of existing native OS standards. So we're not swimming upstream from the OS guys. As you guys heard this morning, Apple's here, and Apple's a big proponent of what we're doing here. We had an announcement Monday that Google is joining the AppConfig community, so they're on board with Android. So we're working with the OS guys to build additions on top of their existing native standards to simplify app development and accelerate adoption of business apps, transformational business apps, no less. The logistics are really simple. The membership in AppConfig community is open to everyone. Any ISV and every EMM vendor is allowed to be part of the community. They have to agree to a native approach. The community will deliver tools, best practices, and forums, among other things, to unite developers in building these standards. And most importantly is governance. Neutrality in the community is enforced by our agreement. So anyone who commits to the community has to contractually commit to being a neutral vendor. And this really prevents, we don't want someone coming in and pushing their own proprietary standards through the community. We want to be open to everybody and work across the board. So for deliverables, the AppConfig community, while still being very, very young, we're only a couple of months old, our first deliverable has been this XML schema. Let me take a quick aside here and ask, who's familiar with iOS Managed App Config? Anyone? Oh, cool. All right. For people who are not familiar with Managed App Config, it's an iOS standard way to push configurations down to applications. And what it is basically key value pairs, which is great. The challenge is with it is there's no structure to it, it's just key value pairs. So what the AppConfig community agreed to is to build an XML schema which defines data types, and it makes the use of Managed App Config much simpler. And I'll show you some examples of how that works. But the idea is that as a developer, you get consistency across your apps and how you send configurations to them. Your IT guys in your enterprises get consistency across different EMM vendors and across different EMMs. And then your EMM admins actually get a really nice user experience in configuring applications. Again, we'll see examples. And the most important one is it's supported by Apple MPP program. So if you're doing MPP, this will be the way to configure your applications through MPP going forward. The community will also deliver other best practices for developers down the road. Right now we're focused on app configuration. If you go to the website, there's already practices for security settings, Private VPN, doing SSO via SAML. We'll talk a little bit about that. But I really want to spend I want to spend most of my time today talking about this XML schema and showing you guys end-to-end how it works and how you can get started with it today. First thing is important to understand the architecture of managed app configs, period, and how it fits in with what we do. So this is my eye chart for the day. But let me walk you through what's involved here. This chart has kind of 4 players in it. One is our consortium, our managed app config community. We have the EMM vendor. We have the ISV, which is the software developer, and we have the actual user. So the consortium publishes this schema. It's an XSD file. It's simple XML definition of data types. And by the way, for those of you guys who are like taking pictures, this deck will be available online, so you don't have to try to reverse engineer your photos. We publish the schema. It's available open for anyone to use under a very, very liberal license. The developers, when they write their app, write what's called a spec file. It's a .xml file that basically says, here's the configurations my app needs. So for example, my app needs to know a URL endpoint. It needs to know an LDAP server. It needs a username. It needs a password. Whatever information it needs from the EMM server, you define in this XML file, okay? That XML file is then published. And there's a thing here we have called a spec repository. Currently, as of today, every EMM vendor has their own repository. So if you're an ISV and you write your spec file, you have to deliver it separately to Mobileiron and to VMware and to IBM. We're working very, very rapidly to change that. The goal of the community is in the near future to have a single place where developers can submit their spec files, and it will be available to all the vendors simultaneously. We're just working out the logistics of how to do that. So after it's published there, the next thing that happens is your app is distributed either to the iTunes store or for in-house distribution. And then when the EMM admin decides to pull your app in, right? They add it in from there, and at that point the server queries the specification repo, pulls it in, gives a very nice UI for the admin to see what they need to fill in. The admin configures the app. Out of that, it generates a configuration file, which is a plist file, which is the format that managed app config wants, and then that gets pushed and configured to the device. So it's fairly straightforward, I think, but it's a lot of moving parts. So before I go on, does anyone have any questions or thoughts or questions about this process or how it works, how the flow works? Oh, it's that brilliant and clear? All right. I'll take credit for being a really good explainer then. If you guys want questions about this, I'll be available after the session. If you want back with you. Oh, there's a question right there. Hold on. Let me grab my headphones so I can hear.
Where does the spec repo live at this point?
As of today, every EMM vendor has their own. So it's an internal database. But as I said, the goal is very, very soon, we'd like to have one common repository, hopefully on the AppConfig community website, where you can just upload your spec and be done with it. I mean, like this process right here, there's a little bit of friction there for the developer today, but we're aware of it when we fix it. All right, anyone else? Okay, let's move on then. So what I want to show you next is how do you get started? The screenshots I'm going to show you here are from our cloud platform. Our core product, the UI and the experience is slightly different. The concepts are the same though, but I like showing the cloud UI because it's really nice. This is a portion of a spec file that a developer would write for a sample app. I took this from the Cisco Jabber application, and you can see it's pretty straightforward. There's key names that tells you what type it is, tells you what languages they support, tells you what options are for them. I mean, it's human readable. There's no magic for it. Any XML editor app can be used to write this. After the developer writes this file and then validates against the schema, they submit it. And where the magic happens is from there on out. So this is the console of our cloud platform. So as an admin, let's say I want to add the Cisco Jabber application. So I search for Cisco from the Apple's iTunes store. I come up with Cisco Jabber. I click on it. I go through the configuration process on it. You guys see, you describe it, you distribute it. The configuration process is the interesting one. So when I click on configure, right here, it brings me to a screen. I want to show you this. So I pulled this out as an example so you can see. But in the configuration, you see there's a space for name, and it says it's required. It has some macro variables that are expanded at runtime, and it has some list. All of this is dynamically generated based on the spec file that Cisco created and wrote. So as you can see, for example, in their spec file, they created a string for services domain, and there's a user variable value called email address domain. That's automatically populated for the admin, like this, and then at runtime, that gets converted to the user's email address. So one of the challenges with doing just plain key value pair configurations is that, especially for very complex apps, it's ridiculously easy to make a typo, or it's ridiculously easy to leave off a key that's necessary, and you just don't know that you did it until the app breaks and your service desk is getting support calls. This is designed to streamline that entire process by defining all the pieces, for example, email address domain, right? It cannot be false. So if you somehow manage to leave this blank, you will get a warning message from cloud before you can do anything. And so it populates it all. And by the way, it's also localized. So I'm showing you in English, obviously, but you can localize it for different languages. We go down here a little further. I want to show you a couple of really cool ones. So for example, if you look at the string called services domain SSO email prompt, it has a default value, and it has two values it can be. So in the UI, it will come up, and here's, I've got it pulled down here. So invalid certificate behavior. There's a default value, and then there's two values they can be, reject and notify or prompt per session. And those are the only values you can select. So that's not something that the admin has to know. He doesn't have to remember the syntax. He doesn't have to remember the spelling of it. It's something that they're able to fill in. It's automatically populated for them. It's propagated to the app, and it's validated. So before the app ever sees the configuration, it's already been validated, it's already been checked, and you know you're getting the right one. What's nice about this is, even though obviously for AirWatch, for example, their UI is going to be drastically different than ours, of course, because they have their own product. But as a software developer, if you write your spec file once and submit it, the end experience will be the same. You're guaranteed that the admins will have all the right values, that it will have all the right fields populated, all the required values will be there, and then your app will get a config file that's appropriate for the app and is not missing anything or doesn't have any wrong values. And we want to remove the friction in doing all of that work, because currently it's a lot of work. We want to make it easier. So actually, before I go to that, before I go to the next topic, any comments or thoughts on this? It's a fairly straightforward thing when you see it and how it works. It's not very complex. It's not, as an admin, there's really no learning curve. Stuff just works. But any questions or comments about the flow, how it works? Anything else? It is. It's that brilliantly simple. I love it. Okay. The one other topic I want to cover today is SSO. So single sign-on is a topic that is really, really interesting right now. Identity, single sign-on, authentication, all these things are let's say we get a lot of inbound queries about how do we do this, how do we do that. That's all relates to identity and control. Our cloud team and our Sentry team is doing a lot of work on that. But I wanted to show you one architectural piece of what we're working on. The AppConfig community has agreed that for doing single sign-on, that SAML is the right standard for doing so. And again, a quick show of hands. Who's familiar with SAML? Okay, more or less. Okay. For those of you not familiar with it, it's an open standard that basically creates a UI within your application, like basically a web page where you put in your credentials, and in the background, all of your authentication is magically taken care of. Your app doesn't have to worry about configuration data or authentication data. It just has to present a SAML, a web view to a SAML URL, and it gets back a token for authentication. It's a very rough view of it. So we have a new product called Mobileiron Access. And if you guys are interested in, I can show you. There's other sessions that talk about this product. But I wanted to show you how this works. And the recommendation again for the AppConfig community is, if your app implements SAML authentication, It will work in any environment that is AppConfig community compatible. So in this environment, you have your kind of normal apps, and you have your secured apps on the device. You also have our Sentry server sitting in the cloud with Access, and then you have your identity management software. This could be internal to your enterprise. This could be an external IDP. It could be Okta. It could be Ping, one of those guys, or it could be this could be an internal Active Server directory. And then we have an app, let's say Salesforce, for example, that wants to work with your users, but they don't want to have to write custom authentication pieces for your particular users. So what the Salesforce guys do, and actually a really good example because they're compatible with this, is they're going to pick up a configuration that gives them a SAML endpoint, a URL, effectively, right? So there's a configuration that's sent to Salesforce that tells it the URL. Oops, sorry, there we go. And it knows then, once it gets the configuration, that when it gets any authentication requests, hey, I'm going to go ask this guy. So your user launches their Salesforce app. It creates a tunnel to go through your network. It goes to Salesforce. Salesforce goes, hey, I better go ask the access guys for this. Which then also creates a SAML instance where it goes and queries whatever your backend identity management software is. It sends back a SAML token, which then is sent to Salesforce, and now Salesforce can use that token to authenticate itself to any control point in your network. So the beauty of this is that Salesforce doesn't have to know anything about the internal infrastructure of your enterprise. It doesn't have to know if you use an external IDP, or if you use Active Directory, or if you have your own homebrewed solution. As long as you have a SAML interface on the front of it, any app that supports this protocol is then able to take advantage of it. This is a really powerful thing, and we'll be talking about this in the upcoming months. You'll hear lots more product announcements from us. But again, from the AppConfig community side, we've agreed across vendors that this is the right way to do single sign-on and authentication for applications, and this is the way to avoid having individual developers have to know about the internal guts of your authentication system in order to properly work in the enterprise.